Ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, I think we can start. This is our final panel. Normally, it's a good thing and a bad thing at the same time. But I hope we're going to see the good thing about it, because we want to close with a bang. And you can see it like those who enjoyed a smaller panel. I have close to a full panel. So I'll advise that we kindly stick to the allocated 10 minutes as much as possible. Of course, there's going to be a bit of time for questions and understanding. We're going to start with Matume's presentation on regional value chains. Then we'll go to Tizita, and then we will go to Ivan, and finally Henok is going to finish with the environment. So without wasting any further time, Matume, you have the floor.
Okay. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Chair, for the opportunity. My name is Matume. My area of specialization is agro-food value chains, climate change, food and nutrition security, as well as the agrarian household economy. So I really appreciate this opportunity to share or to showcase some of the work that we are doing as the agro-food chains unit of the National Agricultural Marketing Council of South Africa. So my presentation is titled Factors Influencing the Emerging Economies Engagement in the Regional Value Chains. So this is a comparative analysis between the Tanzania and South Africa's agricultural value chain using the time series from 1997 to 2022. So in terms of the presentation outline, yeah, I will skip the presentation outline because of time. But looking at the background of the study, the panel discussions as well as the presentations that we had over the last 2 days confirms that the concept of regional value chain has gained significant attention to foster economic development and promote sustainable growth for most of the African countries. This is supported by the surge of economies with regards to the inclusion of agricultural industry in terms of shifting towards increased regionalization. So this is where industries strategically arrange their production as well as distribution network to capitalize on the benefits of the regional integration. So in this case, we have seen the implementation of free trade areas policies, creating the innovative opportunities for the countries that are engaging on these free trade agreements. In this instance, since the implementation of the CFTA agreement, the member states such as Tanzania as well as South Africa have welcomed all these opportunities to innovate and as well as to engage in the regional value chains. However, the participation of emerging economies such as South Africa and Tanzania in regional value chain is influenced by a number of challenges that needs to be thoroughly examined. We can attest that for countries that are part of the free trade areas, these agreements provided the framework for reducing trade barriers and promoting cooperation among member states. However, the effectiveness of these arrangements in fostering the regional value chain engagement is dependent on the extent of tariff liberations, the harmonization of regulations, and standards, as well as the facilitation of cross-border trade investment. So in essence, or what we are trying to say is that beside the agreement doesn't isolate some of the factors or challenges that limits the trading of goods and services within South Africa and Tanzania. Hence, if we can look at the statistics and how these two countries are performing in terms of trading with each other, we can see that the full implementation of the AfCFTA with regards to this country is not really fully implemented. For instance, if you look at when I was looking at the website of CFTA, I realized that there are a number of complaints that have been reported to the organization as some of the limiting factors to the full implementation of this agreement. So this shows that there's a need for us to address all these challenges to ensure a smooth implementation of the CFTA. Now, when we look at the conceptual underpinning of the when we look at the conceptual underpinnings of the study, so this figure shows the market value potential between South Africa and Tanzania, and it can be observed from this graph that there is a greatest potential when it comes to exports of goods and services from South Africa to Tanzania. But when you look at the realized potential, the unrealized potential, you can see that there's a huge gap. So in other words, when we try to analyze this graph, we realize that when you look at the export potential, the actual export that the two countries are actually trading with each other, you can see that there's a huge number of difference within the unrealized potential as well as the potential exports. So this raises a question to say, what are the impeding factors that are actually limiting or ensuring that we have a huge number of unrealized potential within the two countries? So what we did was that we collected the time series data. So the methodology that we adopted, we combined the analysis of secondary data as well as the review of different website documentaries to ensure that we analyze all these factors that are actually affecting the trading of goods and services within South Africa as well as Nigeria. So we collected the time series data from 1997 to 2022, wherein we focused on credible data sources such as the World Bank as well as the trade map. So what we did after getting the data that we used to analyze, we captured the data on Excel, we cleaned it, and then we exported it to Stata, wherein we computed the augmented Dickey-Fuller test as well as the vector error correction model. And then we also developed a table wherein we analyzed different literature sources from different articles, as I said, as well as the journal articles. And according to the available literature that we have reviewed, we have learned that there are a number of factors that are actually limiting the engagement of these two countries on the regional economies, but on the regional value chain. But we decided to focus on few variables, mainly because the data was not available, as well as some of the challenges in terms of securing the data that we used to do the analysis. So these are some of the factors that are actually affecting the trading between the two countries. And then, as I indicated, these results shows the test that we did. So before we could analyze the data, we prepared the time series, the data for time series analysis, wherein this table here shows, this table here shows the stationarity test that we computed, so that before we could do the further analysis, we have to ensure that our data was stationary. So we computed that, and this table shows that our data is stationary, because even when you check the ADF test, you can see that the ADF test is higher than the critical value, especially when you look at the 5% critical value. So this time series data allowed us to proceed and do the analysis. Now, this table shows the long-term relationship between the trading as well as some of the explanatory variables that we used. So this is only focusing on Tanzania. So we used the merchandise trade as our dependent variables, and then the exchange rate, domestic credit, the labor force, as well as the population growth were used as our explanatory variables. Now, for us to understand the actual results of the study that we computed, you have to reverse the sign of coefficient. For instance, if you look at the population growth, it shows that there is a negative significant relationship between population growth as well as the merchandise trade. So, in other words, this shows that as we have a high number of population increasing within the country, there's a low possibility, or there's 57% possibility of Tanzania not to engage in trade. But when you look at the transport service, as I said, we reverse the coefficient. If you look at the transport services, it shows that there is a positive significant relationship between the transport services within the country and the merchandise trade. So this shows that when the country is developing in terms of ensuring that the smooth transitioning of goods from South Africa from Tanzania to Kenya, it shows that there's high possibility for the two countries to continue to trade. But if these issues, the issue of transport, labor force, and domestic credit are not addressed, then we will have challenges when it comes to engagement of Tanzania to regional value chain trade with South Africa. But if you compare with South Africa, you can see that in South Africa, the population growth is having a positive relationship with trade. But if you look at the labor force in South Africa is having a negative relationship with trade. This can be attributed to high number of unemployment in the country. So you can see that when the labor force is not effective enough, it reduces the chances of the country to produce enough goods and services that they can export to other countries. In conclusion, based on the results of the study, we can see that there are a number of challenges that are actually affecting the trading of goods between South Africa and Tanzania. Our wish was to do a comparative analysis which includes other African countries that are part of the free agreement of free trading, but the challenge was that we didn't get access to data. But when we review literature with regards to all these countries, we realized that most of the countries that are part of the free trade agreement are actually experiencing all these economic and structural factors that are actually affecting their capacity to trade. So this posed the opportunity for all these countries to innovate, to engage their policies, as well as to ensure that they improve the capacity when it comes to how they can capacitate their labor force, and making sure that all the other factors that are actually significant are addressed. For instance, the issue of, just that I didn't talk about it because of time, but there are a number of factors that are actually affecting this participation of these two countries on the regional value chain, and they are well outlined on our paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Machume, for that wonderful presentation, and for presenting the data and methodology quite well to us. I'm afraid you are speaking to a room full of lawyers. And lawyers are afraid of this methodology that involves a coefficient and numbers. And so many of them will still want time with you outside this room so that you break it down to them, even to smaller bits and pieces, so, so that then they can understand how the methodology was applied. But we're very happy to have had that presentation. And now we're going to move a little bit forward to Jezita, who's going to cover cross-border commercial disputes and the guided trade initiative. Jezita, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to the organizing committee and all the presenters. For the past 3 days, I felt like a child in a toy store. I wanted to play with all the toys, but I wasn't sure if I was allowed. And now it's my time to also share a little bit about my research. So my presentation concerns resolving cross-border commercial disputes under the Guided Trade Initiative. And I've divided my presentation in 4 parts. The first part is just an overview of the GTI and the legal implication of its existence. Then I will look at key points to consider when developing an African private international law framework. And I will also look at appropriate dispute resolution mechanism. And finally, I will discuss interim options that business can develop whilst discussion and processes are undergoing. So the first part is really to analyze the GTI framework. So we all know that it derives from the AfCFTA agreement, but it was never contemplated by the drafters, neither by the member states. And when you look at the legality of the ministerial decision of 2021, you will have to consider Article 6 and Article 11 of the AfCFTA agreement. So Article 6 of the AfCFTA agreement lays out, I would say list in a limitative manner the numbers of protocols that are going to be negotiated between member states. And the fact that commercial activity or private international law, or even just the GTI was not mentioned, means that the Council of Ministers did not have the mandate to actually adopt that instrument. And under international law, the explanation of how we got to this point can be found in the doctrine of implied powers that allows an entity to actually take a measure beyond its powers. But what the ICJ is telling us in an advisory opinion is that this decision should not interfere with the powers of other organs. And in this case, the Assembly of States was the only organ that was vested with the power to decide what the ICFTA would be about. And because of that, I would say that the GTI rests on questionable basis. I wouldn't say illegal, because I think that when they worked on this instrument, they have examined all of these provisions. So why is it a problem? It's a problem because if there's any dispute, the judges, the arbitrators who are going to look at this dispute will need to have a legal mandate. And that mandate is based on a questionable instrument. So it's going to be difficult to enforce any kind of agreements that the parties may conclude. So what are the solutions? And I've looked at the ICFTA agreement, and I came up with 2 solutions. The first one is to adopt an authoritative interpretation of Article 11 of the ICFTA agreement. And actually, it could be like an instrument that can be used to develop even other protocols, because state will just say that the Council of Ministers can adopt as many decisions as they want in order to fill the gaps that exist in the framework currently. But the second option is a revision of Article 6 of the ICFTA agreement. But I see problems with this option. Why? It's because you would have to agree on everything that is going to be said, and we know how difficult the negotiations are. So we may end up with a revised agreement that not all the states will actually ratify. And if we clear the legal and conceptual issues of the ICFTA, of the GTI, we would have to also think about developing a framework for private international law activities, because you remember that the objective of the ICFTA and the GTI is to actually boost trade, and it does so by relying on the private sector. But if there isn't a framework to actually reduce the legal risk that always arise in commercial activity, it's going to be very difficult for businesses to cope. And in this respect, I think that Africa has a considerable advantage on the rest of the world, because we've never really been interested in developing this framework. So we can learn from what other people have done. And the European Union Private International Law Framework is a good example, because it is considered as a success. But we also need to consider the fact that there are critics also warning about its incoherent development, because it covers so many unrelated areas. So there are a couple of instruments and forums. For example, the Hague Conference on Private International Law, which is an important forum when issues affecting international commerce are discussed. But if we were to join such a kind of forum, we will need to ensure that we can participate and our inputs are going to be considered. And there's the Rome 1 regulation on contractual relationships. But even for that instrument, I think that we will need to engage in an exercise of contextualization. I'll give you a simple example on the transfer of risk. Let's imagine that goods need to be delivered from, let's say, Kenya to Uganda. We will need to make sure that the infrastructure is in place, and if there are any delays, we can actually overcome them. And then there's the Rome 2 regulation, which serves as a legal safeguard for product liability, environmental damage, and the Brussels recast regulation, which looks at jurisdiction, recognition, and enforcement of judgment. And finally, there's the EU Directive on Corporate Sustainability. It's an important instrument, but the difficulty is that we will also have to adapt it to the local context. And I'll give you an example on child labor, for example. In my country, there are a lot of initiatives to take the children out of the mines, but it doesn't take into account the fact that many of these children go to the mine because they don't have support at home, and there's no welfare state in Africa. So what are the solutions? So maybe we need also to go back a little bit to our African roots. And in ancient times, we had rites of initiation where 11 years, 13 years old children were taught how to cope with the realities of life. So why are we not considering these options? And the third point point is on the definition of an appropriate dispute resolution mechanism. And if we have to consider this issue, we will have to uphold a certain number of principles and meet standards that are recognized worldwide. And the point of departure will be to consider the principle of party autonomy. And the logic choice that comes when you think about party autonomy is to opt for arbitration. But there are obstacles to the establishment of arbitration-friendly jurisdiction in Africa. There's the reliance on foreign law. There's the issue of mandatory laws in Africa, the enforcement, and courts' attitude. And if we also look at how it's going to be enforced, and if we need to think about a regional court as proposed by Professor Onyema, we also need to consider the logistic and all the practical aspect that comes with such a proposition. And finally, on the issue of enforcement, there are different standards across countries due to the layout of the New York Convention, which allows for reservations, especially on commerciality, and we have different commercial law, so how is it going to work finally? And the last point that I wanted to make is actually on the players, because when we speak about the GTI and the AfCFTA, it's always at the macroeconomic level. So I think there's a semantic problem. We need to know that it's an instrument that needs to help us to monetize incentives and create opportunities for Africans. And I'm just taking the examples of law firms and arbitral institutions, given that we speak about commercial dispute resolution. And I wanted to share with you a few statistics. For example, it says that 80 to 90% of the legal fees paid on African matters are actually paid out of Africa. And global firms in the US and in the UK have been identified as the beneficiary of over $10 million. And you can see there are very limited numbers of firms instructed on this kind of cases. And the second category is international students, because one of the arguments that usually come up is that there isn't expertise in Africa, but we have more and more people studying abroad, and they contribute to those economies. But the problem is that when they leave those countries, they just go back home with a degree, some skills, and not many prospects. And if they want to consider staying in the UK or the US, they have either the OPT of the post-study visa, and then they are told, okay, you wrap up, you go back home. But when you go back home, what you find out is that the institution you've left in the West are actually doing your job. So are we really thinking about this? And finally, I'll speak about arbitral institution, because a Queen Mary International Arbitration Survey found that African business rely on international arbitration centers. And African arbitration centers actually work on less than 20% of the cases globally. So I really think that there's an opportunity to rethink about these issues. And I would also encourage policies to develop the use of, yes, I'm going to wrap up. Yes, okay. Finally, I think that there are best practices across the world. There are treaties, there are countries that are looking at this issue, such as Singapore, India, and Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much for attention.
Thank you to Zita for taking us through all the way from, GTI to private international law, then to regional actors, including arbitration centers, just a very wide survey of what's happening in terms of commercial dispute settlement. As Ivan is setting up, I would like you to consider one of the concerns that I think Regis raised yesterday with this private international law frameworks. Why do we have to go to Europe to find models when we have OHADA here that has been trying to do this for over a decade? I mean, I find that a little bit strange sometimes, that we have this idea that what's happening in Europe is a good sort of a model. While I know that OHADA has its own challenges, and this is interesting because you come from OHADA region, so perhaps it's also, you might have some insights here. Why not improve what the model that OHADA is already setting up, so that then we can replicate it, rather than looking at the Hague conventions and the rest? Just a consideration that you will have, and I suspect someone will have asked this question anyway because Regis raised it, I think yesterday, in this discussion. So I see Ivan is ready, and now we move from commercial dispute settlement to sports. So you have the floor.
Morning, everyone. Sorry, good afternoon. My name is Ivan Otakol. I'm a legal practitioner from Uganda. I'm a partner at a law firm called Matrix Advocates, and I also do some teaching at the University of Poland, the International University. So I'm privileged to be here to present such an ambitious project like an AfCFTA protocol on sports. As we all know, sports has since moved on from just games, from just leisure, from just physical activity, to a multi-billion-dollar global industry. Africa, unfortunately, like the discussion has always been about global trade, is again on the periphery. Africa only contributes or enjoys about 0.5% of the global sports GDP, as opposed to it's about 3%. Sports now contributes about 3% of the global trade GDP, and Africa is just at the periphery at about 0.5%, which is very unfortunate. Ironically, for an activity that's supposed to bring people together and that has brought people together for ages, I'm sure many of you who are sports lovers or football fans, a few weeks ago, all had your eyes glued on TV as Spain took on England, right? The Olympics are coming up very soon, and many of you, your weekends are going to be packed, or even